When it comes to cybersecurity, the biggest threats are the ones you never see coming. SecureWorks detects and responds to cyber attackers' ever-changing tactics. We come armed with Taegis, a security analytics platform designed to recognize attacks and stop them before they do harm. SecureWorks, defending every corner of cyberspace. Learn more at securityweekly.com/SecureWorks. The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys CloudView, the next generation of cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. CloudView enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, and prove compliance in audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions often and will reach out to you once reviewed. This segment is sponsored by Ping Identity. To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/ping. Jason Oeltjen is the Vice President of Product Management for Ping Identity, where he focuses on understanding identity challenges of customers and aligning Ping's capabilities to meet those needs. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We have similar roles in product management, so we can share war stories together. It's always fun.
Love that.
Yeah, so do I. So we're going to talk about this concept of moving identities into the cloud. And as Adrian was preparing me for this segment, he said, I was a little surprised by the description because it suggests that there's an opportunity to replace on-prem IAM products with cloud. Aside from AD, I couldn't really think of any on-prem identity services that might still exist. Are there any?
They're everywhere, believe it or not. When you think about identity, it goes far beyond what Active Directory is providing you. And on-prem includes, there's so many companies that have web access management, like products like SiteMinder, Oracle on-prem, IBM services on-prem. And it's actually surprising to me that the number of those sort of core services of legacy that still exist. But beyond that, Active Directory may be where you put your identity stores and manage your groups, but is that where you're driving your passwordless experience? It's not doing your risk-based analytics to figure out who should access what and if the people are who they claim to be. And all of those services are important cloud services as well as part of identity.
Yeah, and I would imagine that some of those systems are also on-prem. So are we seeing early days, right? I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. I'm old. The days of identity, everything was kind of on-prem. Everything was there. And all my additional systems were on-prem. And you talk about these legacy environments, my ERP systems and all these old systems that have just hung out forever. And so is that including other like privileged access management solutions, et cetera? Like are there a lot of those kind of legacy on-prem pieces that are supporting the on-prem AD that are just still stuck down there?
Yeah,
I call it.
There absolutely is. Now, like something like privilege access management isn't a core product that Ping does. We partner for that, but those services can oftentimes still live on-prem as well. Those cloud providers like us, there's cloud providers bringing that part of your identity infrastructure to the cloud. And one of the keys is because when we talk about these companies, like part of me is like, I can't believe we're still talking about companies starting their cloud journey or like early on their cloud journey. But the enterprises that Ping serves for both their customer identities and their workforce identities are the largest in the world. Like the 9 of the 9 largest banks in the United States run Ping Identity for in their infrastructure. And so when you look at companies like that, high regulation, they're often slow moving. And any company that's older than 10 years certainly has on-prem identity products. And most of the time, there's still something in their infrastructure.
So if I'm in this environment and
Yeah.
so let's start with why move to the cloud before I get into who. But why? What's the advantages of moving some of this stuff out of your on-prem environment up into the cloud? What's the value proposition for organizations to want to make this move? Because this is, my guess is this is not an easy migration.
No, I mean, the migration is as complex as the environment we're trying to migrate. But the reasons people are moving to the cloud is there's a couple of reasons and some current event reasons. For example, as companies came into COVID over the last 2.5 or 3 years, however long that's been now, we saw this need for this acceleration of a zero trust security model, which includes identity and a lot of non-identity things, as you all in this podcast are likely aware. And being able to support that model in a way that doesn't burden my IT teams. IT teams are strapped, especially going into an uncertain economic environment. They're not getting a ton of extra funding for headcount. So guess what? If you offload all those upgrades, all that patching that you've been doing for all of those years, and all of that maintenance of your own infrastructure, take that off your plate. Let somebody like Ping take care of that for you. You're going to see a lot of advantages, and the total cost of ownership of your systems is going to go down. The ability to scale and protect it goes up because we are using, cloud services that are, under attack. It seems weird, but they're under attack all the time. But guess what? That means they have huge numbers of teams preventing those attacks, as opposed to potentially your on-prem infrastructure. So getting that into those environments, enabling that scale to burst to just like crazy amounts of scale, without you having to like stand up servers or virtual machines in your environment or Docker, et cetera, is another reason. For example, we have a major television manufacturer, and they moved to Ping's cloud to support login on their TV, and they moved right before the Super Bowl. So we were able to burst with them to well over 50,000 transactions per second, which was something that in their infrastructure would have done an enormous burden on their teams to be able to scale to for the duration of the Super Bowl.
And I imagine as we moved our employees into remote work environments, we didn't necessarily want everybody coming through the VPN to gain access to identity systems, right? I mean, this is part of the other advantage, I would imagine, from the cloud perspective, is it supported that hybrid remote work model a little easier and at more scale than trying to shove every employee through the VPN.
Yeah, 100%. And as we see, for those familiar with the zero trust model, the idea is no longer do you do the VPN model where you build a moat around it. And once you get inside the moat, you're safe. You're now putting the security at the resource you're trying to access. And so that shift alone requires us to rethink that identity. And now, as you mentioned, our resources are now working from, well, wherever they want, quite honestly. And so we have to protect them from wherever they are. And we have to be able to recognize them as themselves and know when to put friction in front of them before we let them have access, or when to let them get through in a frictionless way because we have a high confidence of who they are. All of those services are more efficiently delivered from the cloud, as opposed to trying to stand them up in your own data centers.
Yeah, we were talking earlier before the show about minimum viable security. Identity is part of your MVS. There's no doubt about it. I'm an app user data guy, right? The three things corporations have to control is their applications, their data, and their users, because they're tightly tied. You may not own your infrastructure, you may not own your endpoints, but you own those other three. And so to your point, if I'm looking at ways to save costs in certain areas so I can make investments in others, one way to potentially do that is not to have to maintain my own identity infrastructure and allow somebody like Ping to do it for you, which frees up some resources and maybe some dollars to actually go make some other investments as part of your minimum viable security posture.
Yeah, 100%. We see that the teams in charge of the identity infrastructure on-prem are, start with the identity professionals, and their time is better spent not having to patch a server or upgrade a server. Their time is better spent looking at ways to create more efficiency and better security around those users. And so by getting this off of their plate as one more thing of, do I have to do an upgrade on that legacy IAM product this weekend? getting that off of their plate and letting cloud providers take care of all that for you is a huge efficiency savings for these IT teams who are always people strapped. And quite honestly, right now in the market, where the resources, while we're in this strange sort of economic times, resources that can do this stuff effectively and work effectively in this infrastructure and upgrade and IT security and IAM, I'm sure you talk about it regularly on here. Those sort of resources are hard to find. So it's better, if you don't have to have the one doing the mundane stuff of just keep it running, they can be doing more higher value activities for you.
Yeah, finding the resource, but if you have the resource, retaining the resource, because it's a hot market out there for those that have the skill set, right? For sure.
100%. So, the market is still really hard, and everybody struggles to find them. But we're lucky at Ping, and I think everybody like us, we are able to retain and attract good talent. But that's not necessarily true for all of our customers. So it really is a challenging market.
So I assume the answer to this next question is all the above, but it's going to tie into kind of like, where do people start? I mean, are we talking employee identities, customer identities, partner identities? I assume it's all of the above, right?
Yes, all of the above. And so people's journey varies depending on which one of those identities is sort of the biggest pain point for them. I'll say in the market today, we're seeing a higher growth in the customer identity, because in customer identity, getting those identities centrally managed, getting those identities to create great experiences so they can reduce friction for them to log in and make them want to come back and do more business with you. That's a big priority for companies as they look for any edge they can get in retaining customers and keeping them coming back. So we're seeing a faster growth in that customer identity market.
Is that where you see the initial migration priorities coming from? I'm trying to think about, that's a lot. It's potentially a lot of work is part of this migration, right? And so do you start with something like customers because it sets the foundation, it creates a better customer experience, and that becomes kind of the initial project for the migration, and then you can leverage that to then go after partners and employees? Is that a logical first step for most?
It is for many. I wouldn't say most. There is, the customer market is growing faster in sort of new acquisition, and because the customer identity market has been this sporadic do-it-yourself thing, and now that they're sick of doing it themselves and they understand the value in creating better experiences through a centralized experience, that is one avenue, as you described. But another way, I was visiting with a customer this week, and they're taking the opposite. They're saying, "Hey, our workforce is disparate. Our workforce is costing us a lot in infrastructure, and we're spending a lot of time maintaining our own infrastructure." So they're asking us, "Hey, Ping, how can you help us get our workforce to a passwordless experience? How can you help us get our workforce to a cloud-based experience and offload that?" And then you can kind of highlight the highest priority items based on, either higher priority or sort of low-hanging fruit where you get quick wins, and address it that way as well. So we see customers coming at it from both perspectives. It kind of depends who the initial sort of project owner is and what their motivations are.
Yeah, you brought up, I think you said passwordless in that last sentence. We talked about this briefly in the previous segment, right? We were talking about, Google does so much for us these days, right? Authentication with our Google credentials, and it gives us access to all these other things. And as a consumer, it's a really great environment. All I need is primarily my primary credentials with my phone, because I might need my authenticator. And,
right.
And from a customer experience, that streamlines things. It makes it really easy to get customers to sign up and be able to move forward. And that's why I can see the customer kind of experience being one, if you're dealing with consumers that are used to these environments where they don't want to deal with a lot of different user accounts. They want a really streamlined way to log in and gain access to your systems. That use case resonates, I think, on the consumer side.
Yeah, it 100% does. In fact, we did a survey about a year ago, and 50% of the respondents of that survey said, "I would choose one service over another just because it's easier to log in." And then, and even like 63% of those people said, I would actually abandon a service and choose a different one because it's easier to log in. When you're talking about these consumer services, that experience is everything. And Google, like we obviously integrate, so you can use Ping to like deliver your Google One time, your authentication there. And that way we're able to make sure we're doing the proper risk analysis on top of it and capture the data in a way that's actually usable for the companies like trying to give great experiences to their consumers.
Yeah. Obviously, employers, where do partners fit in this? We've seen a lot with supply chain issues. Third-party risk has always been one of those interesting areas. How does this impact, like, what do you do with your partners, right? I think about some of the interesting third-party use cases back when I was working at the bank, and think about having those third partners come in and access certain systems that have sensitive data on them. Is it similar to just another employee use case with a different set of policies around it, or is there more involved in bringing the partners into the mix?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it kind of depends on the type of, because partner can mean so many things, right? It could mean your augmented workforce. It could mean like a B2B2C, where the B2B, the business you do business with and their consumers. And so there's a bunch of different that I kind of lump into that sort of partner umbrella. But absolutely, it often mirrors either the customer or the workforce use case. But what you really want to be able to do is, if a partner's coming in, I don't want to give them the normal login of my employees. I want to let them know I recognize them differently. They're going to probably have a slightly different authentication and login experience. I'm going to put a different set of policies and rules on it. I'm going to create a different workflow, and probably even set my sort of risk scoring and my fraud scoring a little bit different potentially on partners, depending on what kind of partners they are. So it looks a lot like workforce on the surface, but you are separating them and handling them different in their experience.
Interesting. I'm going to let Katie or Tyler hop in here, but I have more questions for Jason.
Before I pass it back to you, Matt, to kind of dig on some of those things, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. I think moving identity to the cloud is a very important thing for the consumer, or for the end point, or the end individual authentication. What I am also seeing is a rapid uptake in machine to machine identity authentication. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that playing out? Do you see that growing significantly? Are there some authentication, maybe not even machine to machine, but maybe endpoint to endpoint, or API to API if we're talking at the app layer? Are you seeing that growing as well? And if so, is there anything new that we have to consider from a application development or business standpoint on how to secure our systems in that way?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I would mention on that. So certainly, when you think about a zero trust framework, you're trying to, instead of that VPN, like, walled castle or moated castle, and once you get it through across the moat, everything's open. The idea is everything's secure at its, at the point of access. So it is trying to make sure you are who you say you are at the time you access that resource. And if you're a machine trying to access that resource, you have to have the same thing. So it could be certificate-based access, and you have to put if it's an API, you're putting some API intelligence around it. So you're using AI to go and determine, does this API call look like what I expect it to look like? If not, what should I do about it? Do I need to block it? What do I need to signal? So there is definitely a lot to think about when you think of machine to machine, and API to API, which is kind of the software layer of that machine to machine.
Yeah, I think the communication paths between applications are only going to significantly grow as applications get cloud native and begin to be more atomized, where what used to be one application now turns into 50. All of those components have to communicate. All of the backends have to communicate. All of the functions as a service have to communicate, et cetera. And so I'm seeing explosive growth in there. And managing those tokens, those authentication credentials, those permissions, so to speak, becomes a largely untenuous or impossible to actually track type of solution in a massive a massive enterprise environment. So I think finding ways to have a centralized system to manage those types of things, whether it's Ping Identity or someone else, makes a whole lot of sense. And I don't know Ping's products intimately enough to say whether that's something that you guys cover, but hopefully it does, because I think that's going to be a massively high growth area in the near future.
Yeah, and the reality is, like, that sort of token server is something. It was the base product that built Ping from the very beginning, 20 years ago in an on-prem software, and that product is still now certainly delivered. That those capabilities delivered through the cloud now, but those capabilities are still the core of what we do. Being able to manage those in those complex environments, like I mentioned, we manage the largest, most complex companies in the world. Major airlines, the biggest banks, the biggest healthcare companies in the world. And so the number of servers that they have and the token management is something that we've been able to learn along with these complex customers over the course of 20 years, which is a long time in a software company lifespan, to be able to do that at high scale and with reliability.
Yeah, and I think, Tyler brings up a really good point on the API side, because the API use cases are not only internal app to app and platform to platform, because it's the internal API discussion, right? Which, being at a product company, we have to deal with. But then it's also the external connections, right?
That's right.
Because now you have third-party partners that need to gain access to some of the data, or you need to expose an API endpoint for somebody to download data. So the use cases for APIs mirror almost the same as identity. You have like your employer pool, which is kind of all your internal APIs. You have your partner pool, which are all these APIs you're using to serve up to integration partners. And you almost have this customer version of APIs that are interacting with your external endpoints to transact their actual business or whatever service that you're offering. And so with APIs, just the explosion of these things across and being able to manage all three of those use cases could be pretty daunting for most organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And not even just across those use cases. So think about, certainly, like, all of those different use cases result in different levels of complexity that we need to handle in that sort of API access management. But then when you think about, okay, this API call came in this way, so this person is entitled, or this, not even person, this machine is entitled to access only this, and read only or read write. Like, what can they do within the context of the session that they came in with, or what do I need to get more permission to do? Like, let's say a high value trade in a banking system where you want to transfer $20,000 from one account to another. That's going to take a lot more security, and we have to have that fine-grained control over that data point and that access to say, yes, you can transfer it, or maybe you can only view it because of what we know about you so far through that API call. So it's those three use cases you mentioned, but then they explode out when you think about the context and the session information we have on which they came into that request.
So you mentioned, in terms of some of your typical users, financial services, airline industry, what are some other types of companies, and is there a size of company or size of security, IT, identity management organization that is more likely to be using your services at this point? Where is the early adoption, and where do you see the growth happening?
Yeah, so we the size of companies we serve really start, if you think about like an employee count, I would say we really start at 1,000. Certainly you sell some less than that, but we go up to hundreds of thousands of employees. And that the larger the company, the bigger the sweet spot it is for what we do. And similarly for customer identities, maybe while we have a lot smaller, if it starts to, it goes kind of 1 million to 100 million or hundreds of millions of customer identities that we support across those industries. So we support, for example, a huge ticketing, a huge branding ticketing agency, and so when Taylor Swift tickets go on sale, those people need to be able to authenticate really darn quickly, or they're going to be pretty upset. So we have that kind of stuff really like weighing on us in everything we do. So just as far as industries, I mentioned banking, we have a lot in retail, in large retail. We do a lot in healthcare, in other financial services like insurance, et cetera, as well. Manufacturing is another big one for us. So, but our sweet spot is the large complex. For customers who have sort of what I'll call simple identity problems, we can certainly solve those, and we do like embrace those customers. But there are other competitors who probably win more of those deals than we do, and we really try to focus on the big hairy ones, to be honest.
Sure. So you're really focused on the enterprise, and that's great. Maybe this isn't your sweet spot, but what would be your advice for smaller companies? Those companies with a couple hundred employees, with a couple hundred customers. Where should they start? What are the things that they can do, either internally or with partners or with vendors? Maybe it's their MSP or MSSP. Where should they start on this identity and zero trust based journey?
Yeah, the first thing that I would make sure, especially in a small company, I think maybe a little be surprising how many aren't using any sort of MFA, or they're using potentially SMS MFA. So the place to start is with making sure that you have a centralized identity store where all your identities in, like, we'll start with workforce use case, workforce identities live, and that you have some strong authentication, and then layer on risk and intelligence so that you are actually making sure that authentication is optimized. You're stopping MFA bombing and that kind of thing as well by adding some risk to it. So that's the very basics. So when our customers come to us, whether they're 1,000 or 100 users and they're just getting started, what we typically sell them is a centralized directory, a single sign-on capabilities, and our MFA capabilities with adaptive MFA at minimum, and ideally our machine learning risk engine as well. Like, that's where they start. And even in the consumer use case, it's a very similar starting gate. It's just a little bit different, where the consumer use case, especially on small companies, it's some sort of DIY or haven't really given it much thought before, and getting them to that same baseline is really important. Now, in the consumer use case, you definitely see a lot more like SMS MFA. And so maybe for you feel like that's okay for now. We have opportunities to get you off of that, get you to passwordless through like scanning a QR code only and never creating a username, or using magic link and email and other things to get you to more frictionless things for your customers. But it's still the same base of starting with like defining the journeys and the experiences and putting SSO directory and MFA, intelligent MFA in front of, in those companies.
So last week we talked a little bit, I know you weren't here, but we talked a little bit about some companies who are starting with the consumer experience, and how that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you get consumers hooked on a product or a process, authentication is certainly a process, then it's easier to get it into the enterprise. Are you finding that there's still resistance in the enterprise space for some of these things? Because, Matt may have said earlier, I can't remember if it was during this segment or the previous segment, we all have our phones with us, right? They're right here. They've all got passwordless biometric options. A lot of people don't like to carry around any kind of hard token. It might be more secure, but it's a pain in the tush. So where are you finding resistance? Where do you think the best opportunities are? Let's say you're in an organization trying to get your employees, your business leaders to adopt these kind of things. Where's the most resistance, and how do companies get over that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I've been spending a lot of time over the last 3 weeks or so visiting with customers around the globe. And the number one thing is getting your app owners, so your IT department doesn't own all the applications you wish would go through your centralized identity system. So getting them on board, and as you mentioned, like moving to like, hey, can I just use my phone, or can I use the pass or the fingerprint capability on my Mac to access my corporate resources? Getting that kind of stuff set up so that you can give those users a passwordless experience is actually an enticement so that those application owners who are like, I'm just ignoring IT, I'm doing my own thing. The people who use, I don't know, Marketo, they're going to just log in with a username and password instead of me going through this IT process. But these kind of capabilities where now you can centralize it and make it simpler for your end users, now start creating them, giving you the demand you want, where those app owners are more willing. Because the friction in the organizations often comes from getting the other people that you need to cooperate on board with the plan, like on board with the centralized identity system, on board with the idea that we can better secure and make a better experience for our employees or our customers by putting it all in a centralized place. So that is a really big problem. And so we've had some big customers that I've talked to recently that, for example, they take this tops down, like there's a little bit of a tops down mandate, but there's also this bottoms up and communicating out what's in it for you, what's in it for your users, to make this little bit of effort that it goes to go integrate using the standards into the centralized repository. Those are kind of some of the most common pressures we getting resistance from the business. I think the second piece I would talk about as far as this cloud migration, a big resistance we get to cloud migration is when you look at the line item of what I'm paying on-prem and the line item of what I'm getting out of the cloud. And while the cloud may not be a lot cheaper or might be more expensive on the line item, we have to get them to see the total value. So we actually have a value team that goes and looks through how much is it costing you for the people to maintain this? How much, how many outages do you have because you're doing upgrades? Or how many nines of availability are you able to support internally, and what does that cost you versus outsourcing that to us? So that total cost is a very important view for us to pitch this message to people who may be running some server in the corner that's running their old Oracle for the last, who knows how many years.
Yes, we know those corner cases well. I want to talk. I want to go double click into the first one, which is the centralization piece, because identity isn't necessarily centrally owned in some of these enterprises. I remember the day when identity was owned by either IT and or HR. It was security had nothing to do with it for the longest time. Like, is it now centralized, or is that part of the challenge with these migrations? Is you got to find all the identity owners because it's not centralized?
Yeah, there definitely is some of that. So more and more you're seeing identity owned by the CISO in an organization. So it is getting, under there. But when I say identity is owned by the CISO, there's always these like disparate things that aren't quite into the centralized ownership yet. And so that's especially in these big companies that have been around for a long time, gone through multiple acquisitions. That is a challenge to bring all of those identities into a central repository. But when you do that, you reduce your attack surface and you have one area to focus on securing your identities and making sure you don't have a breach that impacts your brand reputation.
Yeah. So obviously that's one of the first challenges, get everybody on board. What other challenges as part of this migration you said you guys perform well in these big, sticky, complex environments outside of getting that centralization, which you kind of brought up already. Like, what are those other big challenges that organizations need to address, because it's going to impact the migration? Like, what's the best practice for a migration?
Yeah. So first of all, get a partner that you believe in and you're willing to work through, because you're right, that migration is going to have some challenging parts to get through to the other end. So first of all, make sure you have a strong executive sponsor internally and have a good partner that you can rely on to do that migration with you. Because when the easy stuff is there's a bunch of identity standards that people use for creating SSO and centralizing their organizations. So that's usually the easy stuff. The harder stuff includes migrating your users to a single database. Like some 90% of the Fortune 1000 have Active Directory. But 90 some percent of those have Active Directory plus something. Maybe they acquired a company. Maybe they have this unique set of users that happen to sit in this other database somewhere, or it's not even in the same AD farm at least. So there's those things about centralizing that can be an extremely complex project, and it doesn't have to be solved all up front, but it should be part of the journey. And then the other thing is when you have these legacy applications that identity connects to, because identity doesn't do anything if it doesn't connect to the applications you need. When you have these legacy systems that have been around for long enough and they don't support standards, how are you going to address those? Make sure that when you sign up with a partner, they can meet those use cases. So you're not like, well, we got most things, but we have these 5 legacy applications that we're just rolling the dice on. And so that's the other piece that, where Ping gets into that hairiness, because each one of those could be unique in how the best approach to make sure that gets integrated and secured and the identity is secured for access to that.
Yeah, which means these are staged migrations. These are not all at once kind of projects, right? Because it would be difficult to account for all of those edge cases in one large migration. Yeah,
you can stage them, and some of them that we've done recently, though. In fact, I got a note from our CEO just, I think it was yesterday, about a customer who's like, our users didn't even notice. Like the project team worked their butts off, and the partnership, there was a lot of strain to get there, but the users never noticed. And then you can do that migration in stage, like you mentioned. But the goal is that your users don't notice, but that the project team, obviously we want to make it as easy as possible on them as well. But the ultimate goal is, because your users don't care. At the end of the day, they don't care as much as you do, unless you're creating a better experience for them.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of that bottoms up kind of grassroots you talked about, right? If you make their experience better, they're going to be more bought in to go through that migration because they get benefits out of it at the end of the day.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's what we really pitch our teams is make sure you're selling internally. You're selling not only to key leaders, but to the key teams. Who are the influential teams that you need to go and talk to? And maybe these are the pilot teams that you move their apps first and give them that better experience. And then you can get some good groundswell of support. Instead of, the reverse can happen as well. It's sort of internal marketing.
Yeah. Tops down meets bottoms up. Everybody's happy when they get to the middle.
That's right. That's the goal. That's right.
Right. Exactly right. Jason, thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
To learn how to migrate your identities to the cloud, please visit securityweekly.com/ping. We'll be right back in a few moments with weekly enterprise news.